There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the hours before a serious winter storm. The locals know it well, a hush so complete and so heavy that it seems to press down on the pine trees, bending their boughs toward the ground. The animals feel it first. Squirrels disappear into their dens. Birds stop calling. Even the creeks seem to slow, as if bracing themselves. The sky turns a color that has no proper name, somewhere between pewter and bone, and the air takes on a clean, metallic smell, the smell of ice forming in the clouds miles above. On the evening of January 16th, that quiet had settled deep over the stretch of highway running near the Vermont border. Route 1 to A was a road that most people who didn't live out here would overlook entirely. A 2-lane strip of asphalt threading through sparse forest past the occasional farmhouse with its windows glow. In amber in the dusk past snow-covered fields where nothing moved. It was the kind of road you drove because you lived somewhere on the other side of it. It was not a road you drove for pleasure, certainly not in January, certainly not when the Weather Service had been broadcasting warnings since mid-afternoon. But sometimes life doesn't offer you the luxury of choosing your timing. Cam had been making this drive for years. She knew these roads the way you only know roads that you've traveled in every season, in every mood, in every kind of weather. She knew where the asphalt buckled near the bridge over Beaver Brook. She knew which curve always collected ice first when the temperature dropped. She knew the old farm stand on the left that went dark after Halloween and wouldn't light up again until May. These roads were, in a very real way, hers. And riding beside her, or rather sitting upright in the passenger seat the way she always did, back straight, ears forward. Watching the road with an alertness that could make you forget she wasn't human was Tinsley. Tinsley was 1 year old, which in human years is something like the late stage of being a teenager, that curious moment between puppyhood and full adult confidence. She was a Shiloh Shepherd, a breed that looks at first glance like a large German Shepherd, but carries itself with a different quality entirely. Something Kammermore considered like the difference between a soldier and a diplomat who also happens to be very large and very strong. She had the classic coloring of the breed, a rich sable with darker saddle markings, and her fur was thick and plush. The kind of coat that was clearly designed by evolution for exactly this sort of climate. Her eyes were a deep, warm amber, and they missed very little. Those who breed and raise Shiloh Shepherds are careful to tell you that these dogs are not simply German Shepherds with a different name. The breed was developed in the 1970s and 1980s by a woman named Tina Barber who wanted to recreate the larger, gentler dogs of the early 20th century. The kind of shepherds that had been photographed with children draped over their backs that had served as companions and protectors rather than just working dogs. Barber spent decades carefully selecting for size, temperament, and intelligence, breeding in lines that emphasized a calm confidence rather than a high-strung alertness. The result was a dog that combined the legendary intelligence of the shepherd breeds with a remarkably stable, gentle nature. A dog that could think clearly in a crisis rather than panic, a dog that bonded with its family, with a depth and constancy that could only be described as devotion. Tinsley had been with Cam since she was 8 weeks old. In that year, she had grown from a fluffy, clumsy puppy who tripped over her own oversized paws into a substantial, graceful dog who moved through the world with easy confidence. She had learned, as all well-raised dogs learn, the rhythms and moods of her person. She knew when Cam was happy and when she was troubled. She knew the difference between the kind of drive where they were going somewhere exciting and the kind of drive that was just the ordinary, unremarkable transit of everyday life. She read the world through her nose and her ears and her eyes, processing information with a sophistication we barely understand even now with all our science. That evening, Tinsley had been restless. Dogs often are before bad weather. They detect changes in barometric pressure. They hear sounds beyond our range. They smell things in the air that we cannot. She had paced a little before they left, which was unusual for her. She had stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the sky. But then Cam had called her, and she had come, because that was what she did. The storm came in faster than anyone had anticipated. That is almost always the way of it, isn't it? You prepare as best you can. You watch the forecasts. You take what precautions seem reasonable, and then nature reminds you that it does not consult your schedule. The front swept down from Canada with more speed and more intensity than the models had shown, and by the time the first serious snow began to fall on Route 1, visibility had already dropped to less than a quarter mile and was declining quickly. Snow doesn't just fall in a blizzard. It moves laterally, it swirls, it creates optical illusions, lines of white that look like the edge of the road until you realize, too late, that they're not. It accumulates so quickly on a cold road that your tires are skating on a surface that didn't exist 20 minutes ago. It fills in the shallow depressions and covers the slight rises, smoothing everything into a uniform white landscape where your depth perception starts to fail you and the boundaries between road and S. Holder and ditch become uncertain. Cam was a careful driver. She had slowed down. She had her headlights on. She was doing everything right. But the ice was where it always formed first on this road, just past the long curve before the guardrail section, where the pine trees on the north side kept the sun off in winter and the meltwater from the field above ran across the asphalt and refroze night after night. It was black ice, the invisible kind, and it was exactly where it always was. She had navigated it 100 times before. This time, there was simply too much of it, and the truck found it at slightly the wrong angle. What happens in a rollover accident is difficult to describe because it happens so quickly and so violently that the brain struggles to process it in real time. There's the initial loss of control, the steering going soft and wrong beneath your hands. There's the sensation of the vehicle moving in a direction it should not move, a sideways sliding that turns into something more terrible. There's the guardrail and the sound of metal meeting metal. And then there's the embankment and the long, chaotic, disorienting tumble down into the dark. The pickup went through the guardrail, tearing a gap in it, and rolled down a steep embankment into the snow below. It came to rest on its roof, badly damaged, in a depression at the bottom of the slope where the snow was deep and the cold was already working with terrible efficiency. In the sudden stillness that followed, the only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine, the moan of the wind above on the road, and the soft hiss of falling snow. Cam was badly injured. She had been partially ejected during a rollover, a terrifying circumstance that meant she was lying in the snow beside the overturned truck, exposed to the elements. Her body temperature already beginning to drop. Her passenger, a friend who had been riding with her, was in a similar state, injured, shocked, barely conscious. The cold settling over both of them like a second catastrophe layered on top of the first. Hypothermia does not announce itself. It is subtle and deceptive. In the early stages, you shiver violently and your thinking becomes cloudy. You might feel an urge to move, to do something, but your body is becoming less and less cooperative. As your core temperature drops further, the shivering paradoxically stops, which feels like getting warmer, but is actually a very bad sign. Judgment deteriorates. Confusion deepens. Eventually, unconsciousness comes. They were at the bottom of a steep embankment, in a blizzard, on a stretch of road that few people traveled at the best of times. The truck was not visible from the road. The gap in the guardrail was the only evidence that anything had happened there, and in the driving snow, it would be easy to miss. Without intervention, the timeline was not generous. Tinsley came out of the wreck unhurt. This is the part of the story that seems almost impossible, and yet it happened, and people who know these dogs are perhaps less surprised than others. Shiloh Shepherds are large, muscular dogs built with a certain physical resilience. But more than that, there is something about the way dogs process the shock of accidents that differs from humans. They do not spend those first critical seconds in disorientation and denial. They assess. They orient. She was out of the truck, standing in the deep snow at the bottom of the embankment, and she was assessing. She went to Cam first. Of course she did. She pressed her nose to Cam's face to her hands, reading her with the extraordinary chemical sensitivity that a doggish nose provides. That magnificent instrument that can detect a single drop of blood diluted in an Olympic swimming. Pool of water that can read emotional states, health conditions, fear pain. She knew, in the way that dogs know things that we are still trying to understand scientifically, that Cam was alive but in serious danger. She knew it not as an abstract fact, but as an immediate, urgent reality that demanded a response. She licked Cam's face. She nudged her with her nose. She made the small, worried sounds that dogs make when their person is in distress, not barking, not whining exactly, but a soft, anxious vocalization that anyone who has ever had a dog and been sick or hurt will recognize immediately. Cam could not respond adequately. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her body locked in the early stages of hypothermia, her mind clouded by the cold and the shock of the impact. And this is where Tinsley did something that stands as one of the most remarkable demonstrations of canine intelligence and problem-solving that anyone in the story would ever witness. She understood that she could not fix this herself. Think about what that recognition requires. It requires an understanding that the problem exceeds your individual capacity to solve it. It requires an understanding that other agents exist in the world and that those agents might have the capacity to help. It requires, on some level, an understanding of your own limitations, which is a form of self-awareness that we do not often credit animals with possessing, even though the evidence for it is substantial. And it requires something else, something harder to name, the willingness to leave. To leave the person you love, who is injured and cold and needs you, and to go. To make the calculation that staying is not enough, that the best way to help is to go and find help. To climb back up that embankment in the dark and the blizzard, with the snow coming down sideways and the temperature dropping toward the kind of numbers that are serious even for a well-coated dog, and to go out onto the highway and wait. We cannot know exactly what Tinsley experienced on that embankment, climbing back up through the snow. We cannot know what she felt, but we can look at what she did, and what she did was extraordinary. She climbed. In the deep snow, in the dark, on a steep slope how she climbed. And she came out onto Route 1 to A. She stood on the highway for a while, in the blizzard, and there was nothing. No headlights. No sound of engines. Just the wind and the snow and the dark, and the highway stretching away in both directions into a featureless white nothing. And below her, down that embankment, her mother was lying in the snow. How long she stood there before the first headlights appeared is unknown. What we do know is that by the time Trooper Tom Sandberg's cruiser appeared on that stretch of road, Tinsley had been out there for a substantial amount of time. Long enough for anyone who found her to see the signs of her vigil, the restlessness, the focus, the way she kept glancing back toward that gap in the guardrail. Trooper Sandberg was on patrol that night because severe weather is exactly when law enforcement needs to be on the roads. His shift had already included helping to other motorists who'd slid off on the ice, and he was making another pass down Route 12A when his headlights caught the reflective quality of a dog's eyes. On the road ahead. He slowed. He pulled over. He activated his hazards. The dog was a large shepherd type, clearly agitated but not threatening. She was pacing slightly, back and forth, in a way that immediately struck him as unusual. Most dogs that end up loose on highways are simply lost, and they act lost, frightened, disoriented, trying to avoid human contact or, conversely, desperately seeking it in a generalized, unfocused way. This dog was neither of those things. When Sandberg got out of his cruiser and approached, Tinsley did something specific. She allowed him to come close enough to establish that she was not in immediate distress, not hurt, not simply a dog who needed to be guided to safety. And then she moved. She trotted a short distance down the road, not away from him in flight, but with purpose, looking back over her shoulder. Sandberg paused. In his years on the road, he had never quite seen a dog behave exactly this way. She came back to him. And then she did it again, moved toward the guardrail, looked back at him, moved. Look back. There is a moment in these situations where a person must make a decision based on incomplete information. Sandberg could have concluded that the dog was simply a stray who was frightened and moving erratically, bundled her into the back of the cruiser, and continued his patrol. No one would have blamed him for that. It was a reasonable interpretation of what he was seeing. But something in the dog's manner, the intentionality of it, the specific repeated gesture toward that particular stretch of guardrail, The way she kept checking to make sure he was following. Something in all of that communicated itself to him. He radioed for backup, and then he followed the dog. She led him directly to the gap in the guardrail. In the driving snow, in the dark, he might have passed it entirely. The gap was not enormous, and the snow had already begun to soften the torn edges of the metal, blurring the evidence of the impact. But Tinsley stopped right there and looked down the embankment. Sandberg shone his flashlight down the slope, and in the beam of light, partially buried in the snow, he saw the dark shape of an overturned truck. He was down that embankment in moments, his boots punching through the snow crust with each step, flashlight sweeping across the wreckage. The pickup was badly damaged, the roof crushed, the windshield gone, the entire vehicle telling the story of a violent rollover that had carried it a considerable distance down the slope. The cold had already begun its work on the metal, and the snow was accumulating on the undercarriage that now faced the sky. He found Cam first. She was partially ejected, lying in the snow beside the truck, alive but deeply hypothermic, her skin the color that every imp learns to recognize as a serious warning sign. Her response is slow and confused. Her passenger was located nearby in a similar condition. Both of them needed immediate medical attention. He called it an immediately all units medical emergency rollover with 2 victims showing signs of severe hypothermia, requesting ambulance and additional units. Then he did what he could. He kept them talking, or tried to. He covered them as best he could. He monitored their vital signs and relayed information to the dispatcher and the incoming paramedics. He did his job, which is to say he did everything that could be done in those minutes before the cavalry arrived. And through all of it, Tinsley was there. She had come down the embankment behind Sandberg, and she had gone directly to Cam. She lay against her, not on top of her in a way that would be unhelpful, but alongside her, pressing the length of her warm furred body against Cam's side in an instinctive act of heat-sharing that was the paramedics would later note probably meaningful. A large dog generates a significant amount of body heat. In the 20 or so minutes before the ambulance arrived, Tinsley was providing what warmth she could. She did not get in the way. She did not panic. She watched the trooper work with those amber eyes, and she stayed close to her person, and she waited. The storm continued to rage around all of them, and she waited. When the paramedics arrived, sliding down the embankment with their equipment, Tinsley stepped back to give them room. There was something almost uncanny about it, the way she seemed to understand that these new arrivals were also helpers, that her role had changed from guardian to witness. She sat in the snow a few feet away and watched with the kind of focused attention that would have been unnerving if it hadn't been so clearly coming from a place of profound concern. The paramedics worked quickly and expertly. Cam and her friend were loaded onto stretchers, their temperatures taken, warming procedures initiated. The news was serious, but not yet beyond hope. If they had been out there another hour, if the trooper had passed that stretch of road before Tinsley found him, or if he had not followed the dog's lead, the outcome might have been very different. That was not something anyone wanted to think about carefully, but it was true, and everyone on that embankment that night understood it. As Cam was being strapped to the stretcher, barely conscious, her eyes found the dog. Even through the fog of hypothermia and shock, there was recognition there, the particular, irreplaceable recognition that a person has for the being they love most in the world. Tinsley, she said, or tried to say, through lips that were not cooperating well. Tinsley moved to her side immediately. She put her nose against Cam's hand, the one that wasn't being worked on by a paramedic, and she stayed there for a moment, this long moment of contact between the two of them, this affirmation that said, "I am here. I found help. You are going to be okay." Then they took Cam up the embankment and into the ambulance. Sandberg was not a man given to grand pronouncements. In his years on the force, he had seen enough of the world's extremes, its best and its worst, to maintain a fairly measured perspective on things. He did not, as a rule, use the word miracle casually. He used it that night. Standing at the top of the embankment, watching the ambulance pull away, he looked down at the dog standing beside him. This large, calm, remarkable dog who had paced a highway in a blizzard until she found someone she could trust and had then led that someone to the exact spot where her person lay dying in the snow. And he said, To no one in particular, and everyone present, this dog just saved those people's lives. The other officer who had responded to his call agreed. They had both been doing this work long enough to know the difference between what could have happened and what did happen. Without Tinsley, the crash might not have been discovered until morning, when a passing motorist noticed the gap in the guardrail and looked down. By morning, in those temperatures, the outcome would have been very different. One of the paramedics, before she departed with the ambulance, stopped and looked at Tinsley for a long moment. "I've seen a lot of things in this job," she said carefully, as if choosing her words with particular care. "But I've never seen a dog do that before." She meant the entire sequence, the waiting on the highway, the deliberate communication with the officer, the leading. She meant the whole of what Tinsley had done, which was not any single remarkable act, but a chain of them, each one building on the last. The officers took Tinsley to the station for the night. She was examined for injuries. She had none, not even minor ones, which given the violence of the crash was remarkable in itself, and she was given food and water and warmth. She accepted these things calmly, which was consistent with her nature, but also, somehow, seemed like more than just her nature that night. She seemed, to the people who were with her, like a dog who had done what she had needed to do and was now willing to rest. They gave her treats. They gave her a warm place to sleep. And the officers who'd been there, who had followed this dog through the snow and found those two people alive because of her, they kept coming back to check on her, to sit with her for a few minutes, to put a hand on her and feel, perhaps, that they were touching something larger than they had words for. One of them, in his incident report, described her as having led him with clear intention and purpose to the crash site. In the dry language of official documentation, that is about as expansive as it gets. But between the lines of that report, anyone who has ever loved a dog can hear something else, awe. The simple, uncomplicated awe of a person who has witnessed something he knows he will carry with him for the rest of his career and probably his life. Another officer, speaking later to a reporter, reached for a cultural touchstone that said more by implication than by direct statement. She was a real-life lassie, he said. And then, because even that wasn't quite enough, but better. Because this was real. In the days and weeks that followed, as the story spread and people tried to understand it, a number of experts were asked to weigh in on what exactly Tinsley had done and how. The short answer, which is also the honest one, is that we don't fully know. We know that dogs are extraordinarily attuned to human beings in ways that go far beyond what we understand. Thousands of years of coevolution have produced an animal whose relationship with our species is unlike any other in the natural world. Dogs read our faces, our body language, our emotional states, our health. They read us with tools, primarily their extraordinary sense of smell, but also their vision, their hearing. The sensitivity to subtle changes in the electrical fields our bodies generate that we cannot fully replicate or fully comprehend. We know that dogs understand, at some functional level, that humans are helpers. Studies have shown that dogs will direct human attention toward problems, pointing, gesturing, leading, in ways that other domesticated animals, including our other great companion species, the cat, typically do not. Dogs have grasped something about the collaborative nature of their relationship with us, something about the fact that we can solve problems they cannot, that if they can communicate the problem to us, we might solve it together. We know that dogs experience something that functions like love. The neurological evidence is substantial and growing. The same hormonal systems that activate in humans during bonding and attachment activate in dogs during their relationships with their owners. Oxytocin, the molecule associated with maternal bonding and deep attachment in humans, flows between dogs and their people during physical contact, during eye contact, during the ordinary moments of shared life. They are not merely habituated to us. They are bonded to us. They care about us in ways that are, in the relevant functional senses, real. What Tinsley did was take all of these capacities, the sensitivity, the understanding of human agency, the willingness to communicate, the depth of attachment, and deploy them under the most extreme possible circumstances. In the dark, in a blizzard, alone, with no training and no script. She improvised. She problem-solved. She acted on a plan that, when you step back and look at it, had multiple stages and required her to hold the whole of the situation in mind across time. Find help. Get help to follow. Lead help to the location. Stay until help arrives. That is not simple. That is not reflex. That is cognition. That is, in the truest sense of the word, intelligence applied to a problem under pressure at a doctor. Alexandra Horowitz, one of the leading researchers in canine cognition, has written that dogs' ability to understand and influence human behavior represents a kind of social intelligence that may be unique in the animal kingdom. What Tinsley demonstrated on that highway was exactly this kind of intelligence operating at its highest expression, not in a laboratory, not in a controlled study, but in the field, in the dark, at its most necessary. There are people who will hear Tinsley's story and look for a simpler explanation. Maybe she was just running around on the highway and the officer happened to be there and happened to look down the embankment at the right moment. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe what looks like intentional communication was just a random behavior of a frightened dog. But the officers who were there don't believe that. Trooper Sandberg, who watched her, who followed her, who saw her lead into that specific gap in that specific guardrail and stop and look down, he doesn't believe it was coincidence. She knew exactly what she was doing, he said. I've never been more certain of anything. And beyond the testimony of the people present, there is this. What Tinsley did works. It succeeded. Kim and her friend are alive. The plan, whatever we call it, achieved its goal. That outcome is its own kind of evidence. To understand Tinsley fully, it helps to understand the dogs she comes from. The German Shepherd, from whose lines the Shiloh was developed, is one of the most deeply documented intelligent breeds in the world. Max von Stephanitz, the German cavalry captain who formalized the breed in the late 19th century, was obsessed with creating what he called the perfect working dog. A dog that combined physical capability with mental acuity, loyalty, with trainability, courage, with controllability. He famously said that the dog's purpose was to serve man in every way possible, and he spent his life ensuring that the breed could do exactly that. The dogs that came from his program were extraordinary. German Shepherds served in both world wars, performing feats of bravery, navigation, and problem-solving that became legendary. They served as messengers, as search and rescue dogs, as sentries. They found wounded soldiers in no man's land and led medics back to them. They navigated terrain under fire that their human handlers could not safely cross. They communicated with bodies that were not built for human language in ways that were unmistakably clear to the people who knew how to read them. Tina Barber, who developed the Shiloh Shepherd in the 1970s, had grown up with German Shepherds and loved everything about them except what selective breeding pressure had been doing to the breed over the decades. In the quest for a particular look and a particular kind of high-drive working ability, she felt, breeders had moved away from the gentle, large, stable dogs that the original Shepherds had been. She wanted to go back. She wanted to create a dog that was larger, softer in temperament, more suited to being a family companion while still carrying the full intellectual heritage of the Shepherd lines. She spent decades doing this carefully and thoughtfully, selecting not just for size and coat, but for what she called rock-solid temperament, a stability under pressure, a gentleness with children and strangers, a willingness to engage with the world calmly rather than reactively. She also maintained, deliberately, the Shepherd's intelligence and problem-solving capability. She wanted dogs that could think. Tinsley is exactly what Tina Barber was aiming for. She is large. She grew to over 80 pounds and stands tall at the shoulder. She is gentle. The people who knew her before the accident described her as sweet-tempered and affectionate, the kind of dog that children gravitate toward and that nervous people immediately relax around. She is calm. The officers who were with her that night, in the aftermath of the rescue, remarked on how composed she was, how present. And she's intelligent. What is less remarked upon, but perhaps equally important, is the loyalty. Shiloh Shepherds are not independent dogs. They are companion dogs in the deepest sense, Dogs that form profound attachments to their families and that orient their entire emotional and behavioral life around those attachments. This is not a dog that could have left Cam and simply gone off to find its own shelter, its own warmth. That is not what this kind of dog does. The loyalty is not trained in. It is bred in. It is, in some sense, the foundation on which everything else Tinsley did that night was built. She did not save Cam's life because she was heroic in some abstract sense. She saved Cam's life because Cam was everything to her, and the idea of that, the idea of what Cam was to Tinsley, made everything else possible. The hospital was warm, which after the events of the night was the first thing Cam was aware of. Warmth and lights and the beeping of monitors and the particular discomfort of Ivs in your arm, and then, gradually, the memory of what had happened, assembling itself in pieces the way memory does after trauma. The crash at the cold, the dark, and then, later, the face of a paramedic, and being moved, and voices and sirens. She asked about Tinsley almost immediately. This is the kind of thing that tells you everything about a person, that even in the condition she was in, injured and hypothermic and only partially conscious, her first coherent thought after basic orientation was for her dog. Where is she? Is she okay? Did she get out of the truck? An officer came and sat beside her bed, and he told her. He told her about Tinsley on the highway, about the way she had paced and waited, about how she had led him to the guardrail, to the gap, to the embankment, to the truck, about how she had stayed beside Cam until the paramedics arrived and then moved aside to give them room, about how she had been at the station, safe and unhurt, waiting. Cam, who was not yet strong enough to sit up, listened to all of this with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, and by the end of it her face was doing something complicated that had nothing to do with the physical pain of her injuries. "She's my guardian angel," Cam said, finally. Her voice was still rough from the cold, still carrying the hoarseness that hypothermia leaves behind. "She's my little guardian angel. It's a miracle she had that kind of intelligence to do what she did. There is a word in this, miracle, that is worth sitting with. People use it loosely, as a synonym for something wonderful and unexpected. But in its older sense, a miracle is an event that falls outside the normal order of causation, something that happens through means we cannot fully account for. In that sense, Tinsley's actions were, and were not a miracle. We can account for some of what she did, the intelligence, the loyalty, the problem-solving. We have frameworks for understanding these things, even if those frameworks are incomplete. But there is still something at the center of it that resists full accounting. The fact that she climbed that embankment rather than staying. The fact that she waited on the highway, in that cold and that wind, for as long as she did. The fact that her communication with Trooper Sandberg was precise and effective enough that he chose to follow rather than to simply collect a stray dog and move on. The fact that it worked. Maybe that's the miracle. Not any single element of it, but the whole of it fitting together the way it did, all the pieces of the story falling into place at exactly the right moments in exactly the right order. The officer told Cam that her dog was safe. He told her she could see Tinsley as soon as she was strong enough to be moved. He told her, and he said this with the directness of a person who had seen it firsthand and needed her to understand it completely, that Tinsley was the reason they had found her in time. "Your dog saved your life," he said. There's no other way to say it. Cam closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a long moment. And when she opened them, she was crying. When they finally brought Tinsley into the hospital, and this required some negotiation because hospitals are not generally in the habit of admitting large dogs, but the staff had heard the story and the argument for an exception was not difficult to make. Tinsley did something that everyone present would remember. She walked into the room with the controlled, purposeful calm that characterized everything she did. She went directly to Cam's bed. She stood there, at the bedside, and she put her nose against Cam's hand, the one with the four, the one that was resting on the blanket. And then she was still. Not rigidly still. Not the stillness of restraint. The stillness of arrival. The stillness of a being who has been moving towards something for a very long time and has finally reached it. Cam put her hand on Tinsley's head. The fingers moved through the thick, soft for the way fingers do when they've done this 10,000 times before and expect to do it 10,000 more. Tinsley's tail moved as slow and deep, like a metronome set to the tempo of deep contentment rather than excited happiness. They stayed like that for a while. Neither of them needed to be anywhere else. The nurses in the doorway who had come to watch for a moment and then found themselves unable to leave would later say that it was one of the most moving things they had seen in years of working in a place where people and their families were regularly reunited after crises. She just knew, one of them said, trying to articulate it. That dog just knew her mom was there and she was okay. And the look on her face, she stopped. I don't know how to describe it. Relief, maybe. Or something bigger than that. What Tinsley had been carrying since the moment of the crash, the impossible weight of that situation, the cold and the dark and the highway and all the waiting, seemed to leave her in that moment. You could see it happen. The set of her body changed. Her breathing slowed. She had been on duty for a very long time, and now her person was safe, and she could stand down. Cam, for her part, held on. And held on. And didn't stop. In the days that followed, the story moved through the world the way good stories do, with a speed and reach that has something to do with the story itself and something to do with the moment in which it is told. People needed this story. That's the simple way to say it. In a news cycle that seemed perpetually populated with things that were difficult and dark and discouraging, here was something different, a story about loyalty that did not waver, about love. That acted under pressure about a 1-year-old dog who understood what mattered and found a way to protect it. The officers who had been there gave interviews. A hospital where Cam was treated put out a brief statement. Local news picked it up, and then regional news, and then national outlets, and then the story crossed borders and oceans until people who had never heard of New Hampshire or Shiloh shepherds were watching videos about Tinsley and finding themselves, against all their reasonable adult defenses, crying at their phones. Comments poured in from around the world. From people who had their own dogs and were looking at them differently now. From people who had lost dogs and were remembering them. From people who had no particular connection to dogs at all, but who recognized, in this story, something they needed to hear, that this kind of loyalty exists. That an animal can love a person with this ferocity and this intelligence and this constancy. That the world contains this. A New Hampshire state legislator, moved by the story, introduced a resolution formally commending Tinsley for her actions. She was awarded a certificate of heroism, which she presumably received with the same calm dignity with which she received everything. There were treats involved, which she was more visibly enthusiastic about. The officers who had been on the scene that night attended a small ceremony, and several of them later said it was one of the better moments of their careers. But the thing that struck people most when they heard the whole story in sequence was not the drama of the rescue itself, as dramatic as that was, but rather the image that kept returning, Tinsley on the highway in the blizzard in the dark waiting. For how long, no one knows exactly. Long enough that her vigil in the snow, this 1-year-old dog holding her post in conditions that would have driven most creatures to shelter, became the image that people carried away with them. She waited because she would not leave her mom. She waited because she believed that help would come if she stayed. She waited because that is what love does. It stays. Cam's recovery took time. The injuries from the rollover were serious, and hypothermia leaves its own mark on a body, a lingering cold sensitivity. A fatigue that takes weeks to fully lift, a reminder written in the body's memory of how close the margin was. She was patient with herself, which people who have been through something like this often find unexpectedly difficult. You want to be okay immediately. You want to be back to normal. You want the crisis to be completely over. But you heal on the timeline your body chooses, not the one you'd prefer. Throughout her recovery, Tinsley was there. This is not a metaphor. This is literal. Wherever Cam rested, or sat or slept during those weeks, Tinsley was close, not underfoot in an anxious way, but present in the way she had always been present, the grounding, breathing, warm presence that a good dog provides. The soft weight of her head on your lap. the sound of her breathing at night, the fact of her. People who came to visit Cam in those weeks noticed that Tinsley seemed to watch her with particular attention, a watchfulness that was different from her ordinary attentiveness. As if she had learned, on that night, something about the fragility of the thing she loved most and was not ready to stop monitoring it. As if she was, in some fundamental way, still on duty. Gradually, Cam got better. She began to move around more freely, to resume the ordinary activities of her life, to take Tinsley for the walks that Tinsley had been waiting with exemplary patience to resume. The first time they walked together in the snow after the accident, a careful, slow walk on a clear day not to far the light brilliant on the white fields, both of them seemed to understand that it was significant. Cam stopped at one point and put her hands on either side of Tinsley's face the way you do with a dog you love completely, and she looked at her for a long time without saying anything. She didn't need to say anything. The story of what had happened between them was already written, and they both knew it. It lived in the way Tinsley pressed close on cold nights, and in the way Cam reached for her automatically, and in the particular quality of attention they paid each other that had deepened in the aftermath of the event into something you could almost see. A thread of awareness running between them, a mutual recognition that had been tested and had held. Tinsley went back to being, in the practical sense, what she had always been, a happy dog who loved walks and play and food and the particular pleasure of being near her person. She resumed the routines of her life without apparent drama. She did not seem to dwell on what had happened, which is one of the gifts dogs have that humans don't. The crisis was resolved. The person was safe. The world was, once again, as it should be. But the people who knew them both noticed something that persisted. A gravity between them. A quality of presence. As if both of them were, without making a production of it, aware of what they meant to each other in a way that had been clarified absolutely and could not now be made vague again. There is something this story asks of us, in the way that all true stories about real things ask something of us. We share our lives with these animals, and for many of us the sharing is so ordinary, so constant, so woven into the fabric of daily existence that we stop really seeing it. The dog on the couch. The dog at your feet under the dinner table. The dog who appears every morning at the side of your bed before the alarm goes off, ready for the day in a way that makes your own reluctance to face mornings seem almost embarrassing. The dog who greets you when you come home with a joy so uncomplicated and so complete that it can, on a hard day, genuinely restore something in you. We stop seeing it because we see it every day. We stop being amazed because the amazing has become familiar. And then something like Tinsley happens, and we see it again. We see what they actually are, these animals. We see the depth of the bond they form with us, and the seriousness of it from their side, the way they carry that bond, not as a pleasant social habit, but as something central and irreplaceable, something they will act on without hesitation when the moment requires. We see the intelligence that lives behind those eyes that watch us so steadily. We see the love, and we understand, perhaps for the first time in a while, that it is not a diminished or metaphorical version of the word. It is love. It is, in every way that matters, love. And we owe them something for it. We owe them our attention. We owe them our care. We owe them the quality of relationship that they bring to us, the constancy, the presence, the genuine engagement. We owe them the recognition that they are not accessories to our lives, not conveniences, not background figures in our story. They are participants. They are family. Tinsley did not save Cam's life because she was trained to. She was not trained to do what she did. She did it because Cam was her person, and her person was in danger, and she would not stop until she had done everything within her power to help. That is not training. That is character. That is, in the deepest sense, who she is. Late at night sometimes, when the details of stories like this one come back to you, you find yourself thinking about that particular image, the dog on the highway. The blizzard coming down. The empty road stretching away to darkness in both directions. The cold that is not metaphorical, that is literal and life-threatening, that is working with terrible efficiency on the two people at the bottom of the embankment. And Tinsley, standing in the middle of all of it, waiting. She did not know when help would come. She did not know if it would come. She knew only that Cam was down there, and that she could not help Cam alone, and that if she stayed and waited and communicated as clearly as she could with every person who passed, then eventually there was a chance. She stayed on that premise. She stayed on that hope. When Trooper Sandberg's headlights came around the curve and found her, she was ready. She had been ready. She would have stayed ready for as long as it took. There is a word in some languages for the kind of loyalty that doesn't calculate, that doesn't weigh the odds, that simply orients toward the thing it loves and refuses to move away from that orientation regardless of what the circumstances demand. English doesn't have one word for it. We have to say it in a sentence, the kind of loyalty that stays. Tinsley had that. She has it still. Today, she is a happy, playful dog in the home of the person she loves most in the world. She goes for walks. She plays. She sleeps in warm places. She does the ordinary, beautiful things that dogs do when life is going well. She is, by all accounts, as joyful and present as any dog you've ever met. But somewhere inside her, written in whatever dogs carry forward from the events that shaped them, is that night. The crash, the cold. The embankment. The climb. The highway. The waiting. The headlights coming around the curve. She did what she had to do. It was enough, and the person she loves is safe. That is the whole of it. It is more than enough. It is, in fact, everything. This story is based on the real events involving Tinsley, a Shiloh shepherd, and Trooper Tom Sandberg of the New Hampshire State Police. Cam and her passengers survived due to timely rescue. Tinsley received a commendation for her heroism.